for the archives, of course.
Yes.
For the
We're
archives.
prepping the archives.
Oh,
So,
muzzle tough, Katie.
Oh, on my new niece?
Yes, muzzle tough.
Yes, we're very excited. We are now excited for her to meet her cousin.
Absolutely. Sorry, Rabbi.
no, it's good. That needed to go in the archives. Now it's on the record. It's good.
How did you do last night, Rabbi?
If it was golf or golf, I would have won. But
it was fun. It was fun.
But it was not golf.
It was fun.
So we are, I don't have the sheet in front of me, but I think we're on our fifth of our journeys into the archives for another series of unlocking, another day of unlocking. So we've come through a lot of Holy Blossom history, and now we are into the dangerous territory of lived memory. And so when we're in that territory, it's really important for us to remember that our seventh session is going to be a chance for you to share your own stories, which will also be recorded and therefore instantly admitted into our archival history at Holy Blossom for the next generation of archivists to unlock and enjoy and share your stories in different ways. And so it's my pleasure that we have the chance to learn from Emily Albert.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So let me know if you can't hear me or anything, please, and feel free to type questions into the chat and I'll try to check them. But so as Rabbi Helfman said, we're in the territory of lived memory, but not for myself. So I have the unique and odd position or role of telling you about people you may well know very well. So the way I approach this is trying to understand what the archives could unlock for me. So I really just sort of dug through the documents we had and read some book chapters that seemed relevant. And I'll try to point out those pieces that were interesting that we have in our archives that might not be as sort of well known or remembered. But as I already said to my committee folk, whatever that word is, if there's something you want to elaborate on, like I will gladly defer to the experts for questions. If there's something beyond me, I again will defer to the experts. But that said, Katie has graciously agreed to help me with slides. And also the other thing I just want to note is that we're going to try to think about the evolution of reform as we have been ongoingly, but also connections to today in terms of these two rabbis, Rabbi Feinberg and Rabbi Plaut's social justice and human rights work. It was unbelievable in reading some of their writing, how eerie it felt, like that I could have been reading the Globe and Mail yesterday. So hopefully that will become clear. Katie, are we okay to share slides? Awesome. Yay, thanks. Okay, so Feinberg, Plaut, and social justice. So first we're going to talk about Feinberg. And I'm going to spend a lot less time, ideally, on Feinberg, just because there's so much to cover. But we'll focus on how he sort of set the stage and planted seeds for Rabbi Plaut. So he was born in 1899. Oh, and I did want to share that Plaut has remarked that in the succession of Holy Blossom rabbis, Feinberg was surely the most colorful. Slide. Okay, so in terms of his childhood, he was born in 1899 in a small coal mining town of Bel Air, Ohio, across the river from Wheeling, West Virginia. And he was the seventh of 10 kids, so from a poor family. Parents, Nathan and Sarah, May Niselowitz, probably butchering that, came from Lithuania, so they came over with her family. And her father, his father rather, had tried to be a rabbi, but his passion was singing, so he tried as a chazan, but didn't really liked taking notes from congregants, and decided that he preferred to be self-employed, and he made his living as a mender of umbrellas. And Rabbi Feinberg remembers him as a rather unhappy man. It said he had a fairly vicious temper toward his children, but otherwise he had a sort of playful childhood, spent a lot of time in nature, and then also put himself through school, working jobs in, I believe, the steel industry because of where he grew up. And his small town had an Orthodox and a Reform shul, which is surprising. And neither had a rabbi, but he grew up at the Orthodox shul. And yeah, slide please, Katie. So the question then is, how did he come to Reform? So in 1916, his father, affectionately known as Plaut Feinberg, attended a rally in Wheeling, West Virginia for war refugees. And Rabbi Abba Silver was speaking, and he was enthralled. He came home feeling very emotional, and Rabbi Feinberg, Abraham, said, "I have to go hear this man for myself." About to be valedictorian at Bel Air High School, he goes to hear Silver himself for a Friday service, and he reports that an intellectualized thunder rolled out from him. And then he took the streetcar home in a daze. And Silver went on to be a very important preacher and Zionist leader, but what matters to us for Holy Blossom is that this was a crucial moment for Abraham Feinberg and his move to Reform from Orthodoxy. Slide. So at that point, you could enter HUC straight out of high school. So he entered in 1916 and was ordained in 1924 with a dual degree, a BA from the University of Cincinnati. He took on his first pulpit in Niagara Falls and then spent some time as well in Wheeling, West Virginia. And then he was tapped to be co-rabbi at Temple Israel in New York in 1927. And at the time, that was the second largest Reform congregation in New York City. And the senior rabbi retired soon after he got there, so he was senior rabbi, still in his 20s. And it was a prosperous synagogue, and he felt like a bit of a fish out of water, I think, in that environment. He gave an anti-war sermon one Friday night that was fairly ill-received, and he reports sort of went in one turning out the other. And so in 1930, he resigned from the temple and the rabbinate, and he says in his memoirs, "Organized religion is a deserted lighthouse. The tides of human energy beat on other shores." Slide. I do not know, Anne, what he got his BA, and that's a good question. He went for voice lessons then in Fontainebleau in France, and then came back and was filling in on radio shows and got picked up for a show 5 nights a week on NBC, broadcast out of Radio City. So at this point, he was making reasonable money. He developed a strong fan club. So he was going by Anthony or Tony Frome at this point, and the fan club called themselves the Anthony Frome Fellowship. And they had a bulletin called the Court of the Poet Prince. And the group became very committed to nurturing racial brotherhood. So this was sort of the first we see of him involved in racial justice circles. And he also, when he went on tour, reports sort of feeling for his vaudeville peers that were really living paycheck to paycheck and who would seek his guidance. But then, as we know, because he comes to Holy Blossom, he turns back to his rabbinic work. Slide, please. In his memoirs, he says that the rise of fascism and a moral imperative were the reasons for this. So he returns to Mount Nebo, a congregation in Manhattan. But since that time, he had said, "Tony and Abe have dwelt not always amicably inside my skin." So he's a complicated person, and he's sort of struggling to reconcile two identities: an artist and a rabbi, a thinker, a structured thinker, and a free thinker. So when he comes to Holy Blossom, he was tapped by his old friend and classmate from HEC, Eisendrath, and that was in 1943. And then Eisendrath moved to the UAHC to take on the presidency there. So in the fall of 1943, oh, slide, please. Yes, no, you're good. Sorry, you're good. Two back, please. I'm sorry. Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, so the Sunday lecture at the time was really, that was the service. And the topic would be printed in advance, and there would be attendance of Gentiles and broadcast on the radio, and it would be printed for sale and printed in the bulletin. His first Sunday lecture was on the light in the wilderness. And for that first year, he gave lectures on a range of current events, and really sort of took the opportunity to voice who he was and his views and where the congregation should be going. Slide. But then he sort of starts to bring us from classical reform back to Jewish tradition. Unlike his immediate predecessors, he's the one that's really bringing tradition back into Holy Blossom Temple, and setting the stage for Rabbi Plaut to continue to do so as well. So the first thing he did is he put in place the evening service in place of the Sunday morning lecture. So that would be Friday evenings at 8:15 and then 8:35. And it was hugely successful. There would be crowds of 300 to 400 people, mainly congregants in this case, rather than folks from outside the community. And it was really a mainstay of worship at Holy Blossom until at least the early 80s. Still, the topics would be published in advance, but there was more sort of worship involved as well. He also chanted Kiddush and Kol Nidre himself, and brought in the real playing of the shofar rather than the organ, sort of mimicking it, which is a bit of a teaser for what Susan will teach us about next week. What else did he do? So he brought about consecration, which was exciting to me because I enjoyed my consecration, in 1946. In 1951, he brought in daily services in the late afternoon, which was actually spearheaded by Brotherhood, but he really supported. Did he chant Kiddush or Kaddish? I do not have the answer to that question. Perhaps we'll save it and ask our experts at the end. And so he also brought in bat mitzvahs for the first time, although they were on Friday nights. Slide, please, Kate. Thanks. Okay, so in broad sweeps, because we want to move into Plaut land, he also brought Holy Blossom back to Zionism, or to Zionism. I don't know if return is necessarily the right word, in a way that his predecessors really had not. Before the founding of the State of Israel, so in 46, if you can see that first article, he spoke out against a rabbi in Montreal who had said we don't need a Jewish state. The Jewish refugees could all be absorbed into the United States or Canada, for example. Feinberg said, no, it is important that we have a Jewish state in the land of Israel. He celebrated the founding of the Jewish state of Israel within the temple. And he also was continued to speak out in defense of Israel when, after the white paper, trying to push back against the white paper to allow arms to be brought into Israel, he was very vocal, which is interesting. I want you to remember when we move into his pacifist stage. So he really brought Zionism back to Holy Blossom. We can credit Rabbi Feinberg with Holy Blossom's Zionist identity that we know it to have today. Slide. He was also very vocal against anti-Semitism and racism of all kinds. They sort of fit hand in hand, discrimination against anyone, was discrimination against everyone to Feinberg. So on the left, we see some articles, and there were dozens of clippings in our archives representing him speaking out in Globe and Mail and other publications against anti-Semitism at a very early time. Even during the war, he was saying that yes, there is anti-Semitism hiding amongst Canadians, and we need to articulate that and name that. And then also he spoke out against the Canadian treatment of the Japanese internment, discrimination against Chinese and stereotypes around gambling. And he petitioned the police board to cancel licenses for race discrimination, which is interesting in light of what is going on today. Slide. Yeah, so he was also an ardent pacifist, really through the 60s and then into his retirement. He attended the Yoko Ono, John Lennon bed-in. There's myth, legend, unverified, that he had a hand in writing Give Peace a Chance, but I couldn't find any verification for that. And he spoke out against World War II, against the Six-Day War even, and against the Cold War, but most notoriously about Vietnam, which he actually flew to Vietnam, to North Vietnam, and met with Ho Chi Minh, and then brought a letter back to Lyndon Johnson, which was ignored. But he did feel, if we look at the article on the right, at the very end, he refers to the atomic bomb and its moral challenge to mankind. So he really felt like we were entering an atomic age, and that this was the challenge of our generation, and that it was very important to educate youth about critical thinking so as to combat violence and militarization. There was a question I just want to check here. Did he address issues regarding Canada's Indigenous people? No, it's interesting you asked that. I didn't find anything. There was one brief mention, and I thought it was going to say something and it didn't. And he actually was a pretty strong loyalist. He loved the Dominion, he loved the Queen. So he didn't really mention colonization in that way. And he also was a strong Zionist, which to me, I wonder if it even was on his mind, or if it was how he reconciled the establishment with arms of the state of Israel with his pacifism. If we have time at the end, maybe someone has an answer to that question, or otherwise we've just got to wonder and do more research. Slide, please, Katie. Okay, so this is going to wrap up my Feinberg piece, and I know it's quick. We could talk about Feinberg for days. And there's a treasure trove of content in the archives if anyone is curious moving forward. But just to wrap up, if I can find my conclusion, old school notes. You can't see my screen. You can see this screen. I'm sorry. I'm holding up an actual notepad with handwritten notes. So I'm surprising myself there. But so Feinberg overall was a well-respected person. He was colorful. He saw the temple through a significant period of growth, and planted many of the seeds that Plaut then grew, which we'll talk about in a moment. And I just wanted to end with a quote in here, if we can find it, that he was vice president of the Toronto Association of Civil Liberties and has been in the forefront of efforts to obtain equality of treatment for all racial and religious groups. He has been an active leader in the struggle to obtain full rights for the Chinese, Japanese, and Negro populations of Canada. So thinking about social justice today, I know we had mentions of Black and Jewish relations with Rabbi Eisendrath and the KKK, but he's really sort of establishing Holy Blossom and Reform Judaism as an appropriate vehicle to engage with these issues around racial justice. So moving into Rabbi Plaut. Awesome. So this is where it gets dicier because many of you knew him well. And my only memory of Rabbi Plaut is sitting behind him in high holiday services and noticing his very large ears as he was a 97-year-old or something, and saying to my father, "Who's that?" And him looking at me like I had four heads, not knowing who Rabbi Plaut was. And beyond that, we knew that he had written Torah commentary because those were the books we used in Hebrew school, and that was it. So I've really been learning about Rabbi Plaut as sort of an amateur researcher, and I'm curious if the impression I relate will feel different than the impression you may have had personally. So I welcome that kind of like dissonance slide. So Rabbi Plaut was born in 1912 to Jonas and Selma Plaut in Münster, Germany, a middle-class family, and they moved to, and his father Jonas, teacher and historian, was the rector of a Jewish teachers seminary, where Rabbi Plaut was actually born. He birthed his first, Selma birthed her first son, rather, as the choir practiced their Hanukkah songs. Thanks, Mom. Slide. He moved to Berlin, but remembers fondly summer visits to his grandparents in Münster. He had reports having a great library in his parents' home as a child and discussing history and politics, especially Jewish history, with his father for hours on end. So here we can see him as a 1-year-old and then a 5-year-old, and then with his brother, Walter, in 1924, who actually also became rabbi. Slide. So he actually loved maths and chess, and he considered mathematics or architecture as career options, even professional sports. He was a great athlete, but ultimately decided to take a Doctor of Laws from the University of Berlin, but he was unable to practice due to Nazi racial laws, and so he spent a year in Berlin studying Jewish theology. And I love these photos because, well, it gives a sense of who he was at the time, and he was this very young, I imagine idealistic, quite handsome man. Slide. So he says that he wanted to know, in terms of why he went to study theology for that year, he says he wanted to know what it truly meant to be a Jew if he was made to suffer for it. So here we see from the Jewish Post, the tutor, Rabbi W. Gunther Plaut, has revealed that with the advent of Nazism, all routes to a legal career had been closed to him. He returned to a study of my own people and faith. His father had advised him, "I think this is the time to learn why you are persecuted." As a result, a tutor was engaged, a young gentleman who bore the marks of the Eastern European scholar unmistakably upon his brow. Shy and soft-spoken, but with an intensity of speech and eye which at once drew me to him. His name, Abraham Joshua Heschel. So we have to imagine that Heschel was a formative influence at this time. Pretty serendipitous that he studied under him in Berlin. Slide. And in 1935, what likely saved his life is that he was selected by Leo Beck to receive one of 5 scholarships for refugees to study at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He also somehow in that year, because he's always doing 5 things at once, it's like incredible. I don't understand. It's dizzying. I can't imagine how he did it all. But he also competed for Germany in tennis in the Maccabi Games in Palestine in 1935. So I thought that was a very fun fact. In 1938, he married Elizabeth Strauss, and in 1939, he was ordained and became assistant rabbi of Congregation B'nai Abraham, Zion in Chicago, also known as the Washington Boulevard Temple. He gained his citizenship to the United States in 1943, and the next day enlisted for active duty as a chaplain. He serves as a chaplain for the 104th Infantry Division. This was the division that fought at the Battle of the Bulge and liberated the first camp, Dora Middlebow. He remembers that though the survivors were starving, they didn't ask him for food, but for religious items. And he also conducted the first post-war Jewish religious service in Germany in the Cologne synagogue that had been gutted, and brought the first Sefer Torah back to Germany. Slide. So he returned to Chicago, Washington Boulevard Temple, and in 1948 moved on to the Mount Zion Hebrew Temple in St. Paul. And on the right, we can see Rabbi Plaut and Elizabeth with their two children, Jonathan and Judith, in St. Paul. And unsurprisingly, he was very busy in St. Paul. He was president of the St. Paul Gallery and School of Art, president of the Minnesota Rabbinical Association, appointed to the Minnesota Human Relations Committee, and headed the Governor's Commission on Ethics in Government. So right off the bat, he's engaging with human rights issues in a formal way, and clearly acknowledged and respected for that. Slide. So he says that almost from the moment that I became active in the reform movement, I became classified, so I was repeatedly told, as Orthodox, a way of saying that I didn't quite fit. By American standards, I was probably a conservative Jew, which is interesting because I was always told by my American friends as a kid in youth group stuff that Canadian reform to them more resembled conservative American conservatism. And so he instituted some changes at Washington Boulevard Temple, which are, so he introduced the Shabbat afternoon study and Havdalah, Hebrew school on weekdays, daily afternoon service conducted by lay leaders, Sabbath and Holy Day services, and Sabbath and Holy Day services now had a soloist and more Hebrew. So similarly to the types of changes away from classical reform and toward a more traditional ritual form of worship, that similarly to what Rabbi Feinberg had been doing at the time at Holy Blossom. And I'd actually like to read a quote to you from his second memoir, More Unfinished Business. He says, "For most of my members, Reform Judaism knew a few boundaries, and this became the regnant mode. Personal observance was entirely a matter of choice. The term mitzvah had the meaning of nice or even praiseworthy, but in no ways probably, referred to commandment, its basic and real meaning. Authority and tradition had given way to personal autonomy, and it seemed that the latter had become the catchword of reform. Habit and anti-Semitism kept us together as a community, while Torah and its commands had little to do with it." So he was really seeing what he saw as a problem in Reform Judaism, of too much freedom and not enough connection to Torah and ritual. And in 1961, he accepts the position of senior rabbi at Holy Blossom, and again decides it's time for a change. My apologies, I just skipped 2 lines because I can't read. So he decided it was time for a change for himself, and took the position at Holy Blossom, and he really admired Holy Blossom's distinguished rabbis who had each left their mark on the reform movement. So that was a drawing factor for him. I asked Michael Cole when I was inquiring about Rabbi Plaut's history if it was an issue when he came to Holy Blossom that he was German. And apparently when he came to Toronto in 1961 and at board meetings people were joking in Yiddish, he was shocked. He came from Chicago and St. Louis. He didn't speak Yiddish, but he actually went and learned Yiddish so that he was able to engage in that level of subtlety. He also made a courtesy call upon arriving at Holy Blossom to Rabbi Rosenberg at Basedek, who said to him, "Bring your temple back into the community." rather than being that church on the hill who Gentiles looked to, because the Jewish community had really seen us at Holy Blossom as outliers. Or I've even read sort of affluent traders in a way, because we needed a car to get to Holy Blossom. We were beyond where the streetcar would take you. And so he sort of reached out within the Jewish community to other rabbis, even Orthodox, and built very warm relations and brought Holy Blossom sort of back and more connected. Slide. He found that, sorry, Katie, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. He found at Holy Blossom that they were much more knowledgeable and hungry for Jewish learning than he had found at his synagogue before. And in 1964, Eisendrath gave him the go-ahead to sign for a projected commentary. And then the same year, he actually convinced the vice president of the CCAR to feature a full-scale review of Shabbat observances at the upcoming convention. So he was making strides very quickly. And so the Torah commentary is arguably his largest contribution, even though it came mostly after his time at Holy Blossom. He took on Genesis while at Holy Blossom, and then each of the other books was meant to be written by a different rabbi, but they all either dropped out or passed away. And he ended up finishing the majority of it, although Leviticus was by Rabbi Bernard Bamberger of Albany. And folks frequently assume it's Plaut. But at large, this text is really his legacy, and in a way, a legacy of Holy Blossom. If we can claim that fame. In the introduction, he says, God is not the author of the text, the people are, but God's voice may be heard through theirs if we listen with open minds. And so he's taking a position where, for the first time, we're writing a Torah commentary where we're not understanding Torah as the direct word of God, but we're still considering it worth intellectual sort of engagement, which was something that was new at the time. It hadn't been done. And yeah, so Rabbi David Ellenson, at the time when he said this, president of Hebrew Union College in 2012, he said about it that it was a real mark of return to tradition on the one hand, with a definite liberal sensibility on the other, which is sort of Rabbi Plaut in a nutshell. Slide. I'm reading a comment here. He was once introduced as the author of the Torah. That's very funny. I can see how that could get confusing for some. So in the wider community, he served many roles, Jewish and otherwise. He served as president of the World Federalists of Canada. He was a founder and co-chairman of the Canada-Israel Committee. He was president of the Canadian Jewish Congress from 1977 to 1980. And this was important because Holy Blossom had been the church on the hill. And while still at Holy Blossom, he had taken on this role and in a way was speaking for the entire Jewish community. So that was a bit controversial. But of course, he sort of won everyone over and took it in stride because he has a gift for saying the right thing in the right tone at the right time. He had felt at the time that our movement had become so enamored of modernity that it had lost track of its Jewish soul. And at a debate with the UAHC, at a UAHC debate, I should say rather, with Alvin Raines, philosopher at HUC, he said, "Your and my freedom is limited by the needs of God and of our people," and actually received vigorous applause. So in a way, he brought in to the mainstream the idea that reform isn't just freedom. Reform isn't just autonomous decision-making. So he does say, though, however, that because the movement was so divided between classical reformers and the tradition-connected proponents, that cost him the CAR presidency for years, CCAR presidency rather. But ultimately, folks sort of came around and he was brought in. And so we have a quote here at the right. I just want to point out, he said at the 1975 CCAR Centennial, "This is how I see the synagogue of tomorrow. Diversified, different in its various stages of search, no longer committed to the walls of the temple, but a living community reaching out to its members." And this really echoes what I hear Rabbi Splansky say often, which was interesting to me, and also rings especially true today when we're grappling with what is a synagogue when we're not in the synagogue walls. So it's like he could zoom out and see the big picture in a way that I don't think most people are able to do. It's really incredible. Slide. Okay, so retirement. So supposedly he retired, but I don't really believe it ever happened. When he went to retire, he began writing fiction. So not only has he published 20 plus works of nonfiction, but also I think 3 works of fiction, which I'm curious to read. And really started planning his next steps and thinking of where he could engage in government and human rights work. So slide, please. This is where we really get into the social justice and human rights side of things. And beyond his work within Holy Blossom and the Social Action Committee, with Martin Luther King, with Out of the Cold, where he would serve alongside congregants, he started to engage in these new spheres. So in 1975, he founded in his own office the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. He was vice chairman of the Ontario Human Rights Commission from 1979 to 1985. Beginning in 1983, for nearly 20 years, I believe, he wrote a weekly article in the CJN. And his reason for this, he says, was to maintain the chain of communal cohesion. He felt that it was very important that Jews across denominations or sects or whatever you want to call it were connected in a way. And in these articles, he addressed secular and religious issues. He really was sort of a Renaissance man in the way that he could engage with any topic in an intellectual and serious way. And then in 1984, he had asked a friend in the provincial government if there was a way, actually no, this would be the federal government, I misspoke. But he asked a friend if there was a way he could get involved in government around immigration issues. And this friend called him in months later and said, yes, I'm gonna have you revise the refugee determination process. So on his own, he found an office, he made the time to do the research, and he developed a proposed determination process that in many ways was adopted, although there was some pushback, and in many ways is still sort of the scaffolding of the system we have today. And then a particularly interesting part of his work is that he became a judicial officer in cases of human rights violations. So through his work as vice chairman of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, he became an adjudicator on issues that were taken up or that were brought to the commission and taken up for essentially a trial. And so, yeah, slide please. I just want to highlight a few of these decisions. I think the Sikh Kirpan affair and decision was fairly well publicized, and the others perhaps less so. But these were the ones I found of note and potentially 100% still relevant today. So I'm going to read you some of his reflections on these 3 issues. In terms of the Sikh Kirpan, so the Kirpan is a dagger that is one of the 5 Ks that a Sikh person is to wear. It's part of their ritual garb. It is not to be used unethically. It's a piece of ritual clothing that shows your commitment to your faith in very basic terms. So there was an issue that Sikh teachers were being asked not to wear their kirpan in schools because it was seen as a weapon. And so the controversy was brought to the Human Rights Commission as a religious freedom issue and also a child security safety issue. So let's see what Rabbi Plaut had to say about it. So it's interesting. He actually, what I quite admired is that he really took his time and felt a responsibility to consider issues on a moral level in great depth and almost in a legal manner. So he says in his memoirs, the hearing dragged on for a long time. With experts on the stand and journalists in the wings, the Peel Board of Education instituted a public campaign to influence me, and I was inundated with thousands of petitions to preserve the safety of school children. After the first letter or two, I made sure to have my secretary open all mail that might bear on the case and file it away without showing it to me. I had not as yet made up my mind which way to go in my decision, and I did not want to be influenced by public appeals on one side or the other. So he took his responsibility to be sort of as neutral and unbiased as a judge in that kind of sense can be, very seriously. Ultimately, let's look at the decision. He says, my decision then weighed religious freedom against the need for safety, both legitimate concerns of a free society. In the end, I came down in favor of Mr. Pandori and allowed the wearing of the kirpan, though I hedged the permission with some safety conditions. The Sikh community was, of course, overjoyed, but it was not alone, for the press vigorously supported my move. And he discusses in his decision-making process a particular empathy that he feels he was able to have as a Jewish person, which obviously is pertinent today as we see Quebec or even France's religious symbol bans. And as Jewish people and as Reformed Jewish people might not feel them directly or personally, but of course as an Orthodox person you would, and that allows us ideally a certain empathy for other religious groups that are struggling with this as well. So the next was that a decision on same-sex partner pension rights. So if I can find the right page, here we go. So the issue is that a government lawyer who was living in a long-time relationship with a same-sex partner was claiming that, well, he paid into the pension fund. It wasn't right that the government's pension benefits were not available to his partner in the same fashion they would be to a heterosexual spouse. And so Rabbi Plaut served on a panel with two law professors, one from York and one from Carleton. And after 2 years of hearings and discussions, just delivered a lengthy decision, he says, in favor of the complaint. The provincial government, I quote, decided not to appeal, and in May 1996, the Canadian Parliament made adjustments to the federal code, thus following our recommendation and the public support it had developed. Some months later, an Ontario Board of Inquiry ruled that legislation using the word spouse should henceforth be understood to apply to same-sex partnerships as well. So this is really huge in terms of LGBT rights, and something I think is sort of lesser known about Plaut. I definitely did not know, and feel proud and grateful for such a thing. And there was another decision that had to do with LGBT rights that came up shortly after. What became known as the Waterman case. So the complainant was a woman, a lesbian, charged that her employer had discharged her because of her sexual orientation. And so they decided in her favor. that yes, she had been wrongfully dismissed based on her sexual orientation. Let's see what this meant for others. In his decision, Chair Gunther Plaut said the human rights jurisprudence had established that an infringement had occurred if an action is tainted by a prohibited ground. This is the case here, and I believe that Ms. Waterman's sexual orientation played a role in her discharge. A woman, Catherine Bickley, counsel for the Human Rights Commission, commented that I feel it's an important decision. It's the first of its kind. And also the board recognizes that the employer had a problem with Ms. Waterman's openness about her sexual orientation. The implication of this outcome is that equal treatment includes the ability to be open, not hide one's sexual orientation. So for 1993, this was significant. This is a right that some states in the United States didn't have until just this year. And we can thank, among others, Rabbi Plaut for that right here in Ontario. We didn't talk explicitly about race and racial justice, but Rabbi Plaut's sort of understanding of the world was deeply informed by his experiences as a refugee and liberating the camps. And he always felt that he was able to empathize on a very deep level with other religions and races because of his Judaism and the persecution of the Jews, and that was important in informing our values, our social justice work. Although he didn't believe that Reform Judaism could just be social justice work. It was important that was just a component of Jewish life and Jewish values that was informed by Jewish identity, but that wasn't in itself the Reform identity. Slide. Oh, we've got a couple quotes. Okay, I was sad that I didn't have these. So it's not just coming from me, you can hear it from he himself. Those who feared ready acceptance of refugees, he says, should examine their motives. Did they have economic doubts, or did they fear Asians and Africans as persons of color? So in his memoirs in '97, reflecting back on his refugee and immigration work, he's questioning, he's grappling with the issue of racism in immigration policy in Canada. I'll check out your question in just a moment, Anne. He was also proud of Holy Blossom's Social Action Committee's third Seder in 1987, which was a Seder dedicated to multiculturalism and anti-racism in response to some anti-immigrant bills at the time, which was attended by, I believe, close to 2,000 people of all different races and ethnicities. And he even talks about in his memoir Quebecois nationalism, and that his Jewish desire for sovereignty allowed him to empathize with Quebec's plight. And not that made him believe necessarily in Quebecois separatism, but that he understood the importance of acknowledging Quebec's needs and desires as a unique sort of cultural group. So now I will read your question. Can you elaborate more about Rabbi Plaut's attitude towards the Holocaust? I cannot, but considering I think we're almost finished, I will allow someone else on the team if they are interested to answer that question. I believe this is the last slide, Katie. Do I have something else after this? So we've talked about this. Let's end on a quote and then we can go into some questions. So this is one that stuck with me today in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, that the rights of the highly vulnerable need to be made part of every Ontarian's consciousness. This work of education, especially about widely practiced systemic discrimination, should be carried out in schools, in the media, in business, and in all channels of communication. So he's already using the language of systemic discrimination and people of color, language that we're trying to normalized today still in 1997. Okay, so do we want to move into questions? Does someone on the archives committee have an answer to this most recent question? Can you elaborate more about Rabbi Plaut's attitudes toward the Holocaust? Maybe not. I didn't read anything in particular about an attitude toward the Holocaust. I'm not sure what that really would mean. I mean, he felt Holocaust remembrance was important. Came across documents that illustrated that. Beyond that, I don't really have anything to add.
Your mother does, though.
My mother does?
Well, I was just thinking about what you said about how he, I don't know if this says anything about how he went out and learned how to speak Yiddish. So I think that might have something to say about his response to connecting with Holocaust survivors, and which I know personally from my generation and growing up in Windsor, that never, even though I'm a compassionate, caring person, I believe, it would never have been on my radar to go, I need to do this because I need to communicate with this group of people. And I would think that group of people would have also included Holocaust survivors. So
100%. I also think that the Yiddish piece on some level was about his sort of political prowess and his ability, the fact that he knew what he needed to do to connect with people and make them comfortable. But both things are probably true. Sheila, do you have time to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a chaplain in the army, and he, as you pointed out, was one of the first liberators of one of the camps. So my goodness, he had hands-on knowledge, first-hand knowledge, in a way that almost anybody else would not have had. So I can only imagine that it had a great significance in the type of person that he became. The fact that we don't have perhaps sermons that he gave on the Holocaust, that sort of thing. I mean, I think I agree with your mother, Emily, that, remember, I mean, Anne would know this probably more than anybody on, that there weren't even the Holocaust books. It took several decades before those started to be being written, and before the Holocaust survivors themselves began to be prepared to share the horrifying experience that they had. So I don't think it's unusual that he wasn't speaking about that. Certainly, you know,
Right.
first came to Holy Blossom, but anyway, that's just my thinking about it.
Right. Michael, I see your hand.
Yeah, a few things, and I'll try to be brief. He did connect very quickly with Elie Wiesel and felt a real kinship with Elie Wiesel, and brought Elie Wiesel to Toronto a number of times. And I think he said at one point that he looked upon Elie Wiesel as Rabbi.
Michael Cole, whoever he is.
An interesting response. You a few other things. You said that he managed to do a whole bunch of things all at once. He had energy. He attributed it to being a Yekka. He said he was really organized because he was German background. He also inherited it. Those of us who knew his mother, Mutti, she lived to 103 and had incredible energy and never really lost it. I mean, I remember in her 90s, I would give her a lift home, and I would go around to the car, the other side of the car, to open the door for her and take her up the steps. And by the time I got to the door, she was gone, in the door of her apartment, and that was that. She was incredibly physically and mentally energetic and alert right throughout her life. He also didn't sleep very much. I think he got up very early in the morning and went to bed, after temple meetings and so on quite late at night and seemed to thrive on very, very little sleep. He wanted to be a judge. I don't know if you read that at point. He went to law school. Apparently in Germany, you could become a judge by going to judges school. And that's what he wanted to do. So his later career with the Ontario Human Rights Commission and so on was really a living out of his original plans in Germany to be a judge rather than a practicing lawyer. Just a couple of things about Rabbi Feinberg, because I knew him quite well too. When he came to Toronto, one of his first things, and this is in social justice and so on, is Ontario had recently brought religion back into the public schools under George Drew, Premier George Drew. So there was religious education, compulsory religious education in religious schools. Rabbi Feinberg was totally against it, and he advocated tirelessly against religion in the public schools. He was not supported very much by the Jewish community and by his colleagues in the rabbinate, either because they didn't want to make waves. They thought this, could lead to more anti-Semitism. We're talking about 1943. And they were very afraid of the commotion of this. Or if they were Orthodox, they liked the idea of religion in the public schools because then the Jews would leave and go to their parochial schools or Jewish day schools. So he did not get a lot of support from the Jewish community and his colleagues on that, but he was adamant about it always. You say he brought Judaism, brought Zionism to Holy Blossom, or back to Holy. Yes, it was back to Holy Blossom because Rabbis Isserman and Brickner before him had been a staunch Zionists. It was only Rabbi Eisendrath who sort of took us away from that ideology. He did sing Kiddush, not Kaddish, Kiddush and Kol Nidre. And I remember being moved beyond words when the mic was taken by my parents to my first adult services at High Holy Days and hearing Rabbi Feinberg chant Kol Nidre into the open ark. He used to open the ark. He would come out from the side onto the bima, and before anything else, the lights would lower, and he would approach the ark and sing Kol Nidre into the open ark, and magnificently. So that's one of my real memories of Rabbi Feinberg. We have somewhere in our archives a picture of Rabbi Feinberg and Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, his mentor, and we'll get it out and show it to you sometime. They were not that far apart in years. Rabbi Silver was very young when he was in Wheeling, and you're quite right that was an inspiration for Rabbi Feinberg to go to Hebrew Union.
Well, I'm right because you told me so.
Okay.
Okay, just one other indication of Rabbi Feinberg's belief in theology is the fact that he actually was the designer of the stained glass windows at Holy Blossom. After the rose window was in, but after that, he actually determined what the themes of each of the windows should be as we go around that. So if you look at those windows and see what he suggested should be the themes in those windows, you can see, my goodness, certainly a strong social action, brotherhood of man, those sorts of themes that come out loud and clear in those windows.
I actually have a question, believe it or not. Is that okay? I read that during Rabbi Plaut's time in Europe as a chaplain, he found a lion figurine or something from a synagogue that had been destroyed, and he brought it back to Holy Blossom. And at the time of the Negev dinner where he was honored, where I read this, it was in one of Holy Blossom's chapels. Does anybody know if we still have that or where it would be? If not, I'll have to look into it.
He did bring back, I haven't heard that at all, he did bring back a Torah scroll, which was given to him by, I believe, a Roman Catholic priest that the priest had hidden during the war years. And that Torah scroll is now on view at the Holocaust Museum at 4600 Bathurst Street.
Okay. Apparently he brought this with that, so we'll have to look for it.
Question. I think in the chat there was something about Rabbi Feinberg and intermarriage. And was that a controversial issue during his tenure and afterwards?
Yes. We have Rabbi Feinberg did perform intermarriages. Even while he was Rabbi of Holy Blossom, he could not do it in the sanctuary. The board would not let him do these marriages except in his study, which he did, or in another public place. And he continued to do these marriages even after he left Toronto. He would come back annually, and among the things that he did while he was in Toronto, he would perform a number of intermarriages that were lined up for him to do, because he was the only Reform rabbi in Toronto who would do them. And we have a book of them, actually. There was a separate book kept of Rabbi Feinberg's intermarriages. Yeah, and yes, it was well, as I said, it was controversial. The temple wouldn't let him do them in the synagogue.
But on the other hand, I guess, Michael, it speaks to his personality because he did them. So, he went ahead. We know, of course, that he did it. Certainly, I have an aunt and uncle, an intermarriage that he performed way back in the 1940s. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, he was his own man. He was not going to be told what to do by anybody. He was pretty much his own person, and marched to his own drumbeat.
Great. So I'm going to take this moment to say a big thank you to Emily for putting the time in and the research in, and the bravery to step in front of this very calm group and teach a bit about our great rabbis, those that all of us now working at Holy Blossom are in their amazing shadows, both because of their scholarship and teaching, but also because of their personalities and warmth and the way they brought that into social justice in so many different ways. So thank you, Emily, for that teaching. And watch this space, same time next week, as we delve into some of the, I believe next week, again, I can't find right the thing, but we're into, is it architecture and music with Susan? Are you tackling both? You can, here, why don't you save it and tell us what we're doing.
Yeah, sorry. It's primarily music, but it is also in the spaces of our synagogue, so.
Great. We'll look forward to seeing you there. And then, of course, all your stories that you're waiting to share will be the week after that. We'll join together and record that conversation. So thank you, everyone.
So, Rabbi, just one thing. If anybody would wish to submit a question for that 7th session to us, to give us a little bit of time perhaps to think about it, you're free, please, to send that question to archives@holyblossom.org. And as I say, it will give us a little bit of time to maybe do some research if we need to do that, or think about some of your questions that you might have.
Right. And also, if I can jump in, because we can't be in the building, I have the Feinberg and Plaut documents here, very safely, I promise. So if anyone's curious about a particular issue like intermarriage or conversion, there's a ton that can have been included. I'd be happy to take photos and send you over whatever it is that we have.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everyone, for your time. Oh, and just because you're all here, the fundraiser continues tonight. So our interns are putting on a great series of fun events, and feel free to check them out on the website. And have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful program today. Really.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
It was great. Thank you.
Just to address Ruth's question, we are recording these and they will be up on the